Hello, fellow bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. I'm here for those of you scrolling at 2 a.m, working the night shift, or just trying to escape the noise of everything happening right now. This is your quiet corner of the internet, where we dig into the stories that time tried to bury, told slowly, carefully, without the usual YouTube chaos. If you're new here, this is how we do things. No clickbait promises, no wild theories, just patient archaeology and the humble admission that sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones we're still trying to piece together. And if this kind of content helps you unwind, focus, or just reminds you that human history is stranger and more beautiful than any fiction, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more curious minds find their way here. Tonight's story begins with a question that sounds impossible. What if I told you that the world's largest hot desert was once a thriving landscape of lakes, rivers and grasslands? What if the Sahara, that endless expanse of sand we think of as the ultimate wasteland, was actually home to civilizations we've barely begun to understand? This isn't science fiction. This isn't speculation. This is the story of the Green Sahara, and it's going to change how you think about time, climate, and what we call civilization itself. Picture this. It's roughly 8,000 years ago. You're standing where today you'd find nothing but dunes and deadly heat. But instead of sand, your feet touch soft grass. Instead of silence, you hear the gentle lapping of lake water against a shoreline that stretches beyond the horizon. Hippos emerge from the shallows. Giraffes move in slow procession across the savannah. And somewhere nearby, smoke rises from a fire where people are sharing a meal, painting stories on rock walls, burying their dead with care. This world existed for nearly 10,000 years. The Sahara pulsed with life in ways that would seem miraculous to us now. And then slowly, it all disappeared. Not through war or catastrophe, but through something even more relentless. The simple fact that rain stopped falling. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The people who lived in this Green Sahara didn't just vanish into myth. Their traces remain, scattered across the desert, like whispers in an ancient language, rock art that depicts swimming humans, where no water has flowed for millennia, fishing tools buried in what is now the driest place on Earth, and most remarkably, fragments of their DNA still flowing in the veins of people alive today. This is the forgotten chapter between the Ice Age and the rise of Egypt. It's the story of how our planet's climate can rewrite entire continents, and how human civilizations can thrive and disappear with barely a trace left behind. We're going to follow this thread through cutting-edge archaeology, ancient DNA studies and satellite images that reveal ghostly outlines of vanished lakes beneath the sand. So settle in, because what we're about to explore will make you question everything you thought you knew about deserts, about climate, and about how civilizations rise and fall. The Sahara keeps its secrets well, but science is finally learning how to listen to what the sand has been trying to tell us. Let's begin at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as the evidence allows. To understand how the Sahara became green, we need to think beyond human timescales and consider the deep rhythms that govern our planet's climate. Earth doesn't orbit the sun in a perfect circle. It wobbles, it tilts, it follows an elliptical path that changes over thousands of years in predictable cycles. These are called Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian mathematician who first calculated their effects on climate. And roughly every 20,000 years, these orbital changes align in a way that fundamentally alters how sunlight hits different parts of our planet. Around 15,000 years ago, one of these alignments began to strengthen the African monsoon system. The northern hemisphere started receiving more intense summer solar radiation, which heated the African landmass more dramatically than the surrounding oceans. This temperature difference created a powerful atmospheric engine that pulled moisture-laden air deep into the continent. The result was extraordinary. Rain began falling in places that hadn't seen consistent precipitation for tens of thousands of years. Not just light showers, but sustained monsoon systems that could support permanent vegetation. Grasslands spread across what we now consider the heart of the Sahara. Rivers carved channels through landscapes that today are nothing but rock and sand. But the most dramatic change was the formation of massive freshwater lakes. These weren't temporary, seasonal pools. We're talking about bodies of water that dwarfed anything in the region today. The ancient Lake Megachad, for instance, once covered an area larger than all the Great Lakes of North America combined. Satellite radar can still detect its ancient shorelines, concentric rings etched into the landscape, like the high watermarks of a bathtub that hasn't held water for 5,000 years. These lakes weren't isolated oases. They were connected by river systems that flowed from the highlands of what is now Algeria and Libya, creating a vast network of waterways across the central Sahara. The Nile itself was fed by tributaries that originated deep in regions we now consider utterly lifeless. Imagine trying to cross the Sahara during this period. Instead of endless dunes, you'd encounter a landscape that looked more like modern Kenya or Tanzania. Acacia woodlands dotted with seasonal wetlands, herds of elephants, giraffes, and antelope following ancient migration routes, crocodiles basking in rivers that flowed year-round. This wasn't just a slightly less arid version of today's desert. This was a complete ecosystem transformation. Paleobotanists studying ancient pollen trapped in lake sediments have identified species that today only grow in much wetter climates. Aquatic plants that require permanent standing water. Trees that need consistent rainfall to survive. The archaeological evidence backs this up in ways that can still give you chills. In places like the Tassili Naja Plateau in Algeria, vast galleries of rock art preserve detailed depictions of this lost world. These aren't stylized or mythological images, they're naturalistic portraits of the animals and landscapes that once defined the region. You can see families of elephants painted with such precision that zoologists can identify the species. Scenes of humans swimming in bodies of water, their arms and legs extended in perfect swimming postures. Cattle being herded across grasslands, their horns and markings rendered with the care of someone who knew these animals intimately. What makes these paintings even more remarkable is their persistence. Some of these rock art sites contain thousands of individual images, painted and repainted over centuries. This wasn't occasional graffiti. This was sustained cultural expression by people who returned to the same places, generation after generation. But who were these people? That's where our story gets more complex, because the Green Sahara wasn't home to a single civilization. It was a vast landscape that supported multiple groups with different lifestyles, technologies, and cultural practices. In the earliest phases, roughly 11,000 to 8,000 years ago, we find evidence of highly mobile foraging societies. These were people who followed seasonal resources, setting up temporary camps near lakes and rivers. They fished with sophisticated bone harpoons. They collected freshwater mollusks, leaving behind shell middens that can stretch for hundreds of meters. Their stone tools were elegant and efficient, tiny geometric microliths that could be hafted into wooden or bone handles to create composite tools. This wasn't primitive technology. It was precisely engineered equipment designed for people who needed to travel light but couldn't afford for their tools to fail. These early Saharan societies developed technologies we don't usually associate with desert environments. At sites in Libya and Chad, archaeologists have found evidence of pottery production dating back nearly 10,000 years. Not crude vessels, but carefully made containers with decorative patterns that vary by region, suggesting distinct cultural traditions. They also developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Some rock art sites are positioned to align with seasonal celestial events, suggesting these people tracked the movements of stars and planets with remarkable precision. They needed to. In a landscape where resources could appear and disappear with seasonal rains, timing was everything. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these early Green Sahara societies is how they managed to thrive without agriculture. While people in the Fertile Crescent were beginning to domesticate wheat and barley, the Saharan foragers were perfecting a different strategy. They learned to read the rhythms of a landscape that was rich but unpredictable. They knew which fish spawned when the floodwaters rose. They could predict where certain plants would emerge after the rains. They developed portable technologies that allowed them to exploit resources across vast distances without depleting any single area. This way of life required incredible environmental knowledge. Not the kind you learn from books, but the deep embodied understanding that comes from generations of careful observation. They could read weather patterns in cloud formations, predict animal behaviour from subtle environmental cues, navigate by stars across landscapes that had no permanent landmarks. And they were successful. For thousands of years, these societies flourished across the Green Sahara. They raised children, developed art traditions, buried their dead with ceremony, and created cultural practices that persisted across centuries. But success in a changing climate is always temporary. Even as these societies were reaching their peak, the same orbital cycles that had brought the rains were beginning to shift again. The monsoon systems that had transformed the Sahara were weakening. The lakes were starting to shrink. The people living through these changes wouldn't have recognized them as climate change in our modern sense. The shifts happened gradually, over generations. A lake that had been reliable for centuries would start to dry up more severely during the dry season. Rivers that had flowed year-round would become seasonal. Grasslands would thin at their edges. These weren't sudden catastrophes, they were slow pressures that required constant adaptation. And for a while, the people of the Green Sahara adapted brilliantly. They developed new technologies, adjusted their seasonal movements, and found ways to make the most of shrinking resources. But adaptation has limits, and as the climate continued to shift, some groups began experimenting with a revolutionary new strategy that would change everything. They started managing animals instead of just hunting them. The arrival of domestic cattle in the Sahara around 8,000 years ago marks one of the most significant transitions in the region's human history. But here's what makes it fascinating from an archaeological perspective. The people themselves didn't change. The genetic evidence suggests that the same populations who'd been foraging and fishing simply incorporated herding into their existing lifestyles. This wasn't conquest or replacement, it was adaptation, and it worked for a while. Herding allowed people to stay in areas even as wild resources became less reliable. Cattle could convert grassland into portable protein and dairy products. They could be moved when pastures failed. The rock art from this period shows the integration beautifully, humans and cattle depicted together, not as separate domains, but as partners in survival. These weren't just economic relationships. The care and detail with which cattle are portrayed suggests deep cultural significance. But even this adaptation couldn't stop the fundamental shift that was reshaping the continent. The orbital cycles that had brought life to the Sahara were inexorably moving toward a new configuration. And with them, the Green Sahara was moving toward its end. The transformation wasn't uniform across the vast expanse of the Green Sahara. While some regions began feeling the first whispers of drying around 6,000 years ago, others held onto their wetness for centuries longer. This created a patchwork of refugees, islands of habitability scattered across an increasingly challenging landscape. Archaeological sites from this transitional period tell a story of remarkable human resilience. At Takakori, in Libya's Akakas Mountains, excavations have revealed one of the most extraordinary preservation stories in Saharan archaeology. Here, naturally mummified human remains dating back over 7,000 years were discovered in rock shelters that had once overlooked a thriving lakeside ecosystem. These weren't elaborate burials with golden masks or towering pyramids. They were simple interments, bodies carefully placed in the dry shelter of overhanging rocks. But the preservation was so complete that scientists could extract DNA from tissue that had remained intact for millennia. And what that genetic material revealed was startling. The people buried at Takakori carried a unique genetic signature that didn't match any modern African population. Their DNA showed they belonged to ancient North African lineages that had diverged from other human groups tens of thousands of years earlier. They were, in essence, a genetic island that had persisted in the Sahara long after similar populations elsewhere had been absorbed into larger gene pools. Even more intriguingly, these ancient Saharans carried traces of Neanderthal ancestry, genetic echoes from interbreeding events that had occurred far from Africa. This suggests complex patterns of ancient human movement and contact that we're only beginning to understand. Some populations had left Africa, encountered other human species, and then their descendants had somehow found their way back to the Saharan heartland. But the Takakori site revealed more than just genetic surprises. The material culture showed a sophisticated adaptation to changing conditions. The people buried there had been pastoralists, managing herds of cattle in a landscape that was still green but increasingly seasonal. Their tools showed innovations in hide processing, milk storage, and portable technologies designed for a mobile lifestyle. The rock art around Takakori captures this transitional moment beautifully. Early images show the familiar scenes of abundant wildlife, swimming humans, and lush landscapes. But later paintings reveal a shift in focus. Cattle become more prominent. Water sources are depicted more carefully, as if their location had become precious knowledge. Human figures are shown in new contexts, as herders rather than foragers. This wasn't just an economic transition, it was a profound shift in how people related to their environment. Instead of following wild resources, they were beginning to manage them. Instead of reading the landscape's natural rhythms, they were trying to impose their own. The genetic evidence from other green Sahara sites reveals similar patterns. At Ifri Namar in Morocco, ancient DNA from burials dating to around 15,000 years ago shows connections to populations that would later be found across the Mediterranean. These weren't isolated desert dwellers. They were part of broader networks of human movement and cultural exchange. What's particularly fascinating is how these ancient populations maintained their distinctiveness, even while participating in long-distance connections. The genetics suggest that while ideas, technologies, and trade goods moved freely across vast distances, the people themselves often stayed put, adapting foreign innovations to local conditions rather than being replaced by foreign populations. This pattern of cultural diffusion without demographic replacement helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of Saharan archaeology: how similar technologies and art styles appear across enormous distances without clear evidence of mass migration. The answer seems to be that information travelled faster than people, spreading through networks of seasonal contact and trade. The pottery traditions provide a perfect example. Ceramic styles that first appeared in the Sudan around 9,000 years ago show up in similar forms across the central Sahara over the following millennia. But rather than representing the movement of potters, this likely reflects the spread of techniques and decorative motifs through existing social networks. Similarly, the rock art shows remarkable consistency in style and subject matter across regions separated by hundreds of miles. The famous swimming figures of Gilf Kabir in Egypt find echoes in caves throughout the central Sahara. These weren't copied from a single source. They emerged from shared cultural understandings of how to represent the human relationship with water. But as the climate continued to shift, these networks began to fray. The shrinking lakes that had served as meeting points and seasonal camps began to disappear entirely. River systems that had connected distant regions dried into fossil valleys. The infrastructure of contact was literally evaporating. Archaeological sites from this period show increasing signs of stress. Settlement patterns become more concentrated around the remaining water sources. Tool technologies show greater emphasis on water procurement and storage. The rock art begins to focus obsessively on cattle, as if these animals had become not just economic resources, but symbols of survival itself. Some groups responded by intensifying their mobility, following ever-shrinking resources across vast distances. Others attempted to dig deeper wells or create artificial water storage systems. But these were stopgap measures against a fundamental shift in the planet's climate system. By 5,000 years ago, the process was accelerating. Lake Mega Chad, which had dominated the Central Sahara for millennia, began its final retreat. The massive river systems that had drained the Tibesti and Hoggar Mountains slowed to seasonal trickles, then stopped flowing altogether. Grasslands that had supported herds of elephants and giraffes turned to scrub, then to bare rock and sand. The human response was equally dramatic. Archaeological surveys show a massive depopulation of the Central Sahara during this period. Not a sudden exodus, but a gradual abandonment as groups moved toward the margins where water was still available. Some headed north toward the Mediterranean coast. Others moved south into what would become the Sahel. Many followed the Nile eastward, contributing to the population concentrations that would eventually give rise to ancient Egyptian civilization. This migration wasn't a single event, but a process that unfolded over centuries. Groups would abandon traditional territories when conditions became untenable, but they carried their cultural practices and genetic heritage with them. The DNA of modern North African populations still bears traces of these ancient movements, genetic signatures that connect contemporary Berber communities to the herders who once painted cattle on the walls of Saharan caves. But some groups stayed longer than others, clinging to the last refugees as the desert closed in around them. Highland areas like the Tibesti and Hoggar Mountains maintained pockets of habitability well into the historical period. Archaeological evidence suggests that small populations persisted in these areas even as the surrounding lowlands became uninhabitable. These holdout communities developed increasingly specialized survival strategies. They became experts at locating and maintaining water sources in landscapes where a missed spring could mean death. They perfected techniques for preserving food across long dry seasons. They developed social structures that could maintain group cohesion under extreme stress. The rock art from this final period has a different character than earlier work. The images become more schematic, more symbolic. Instead of naturalistic depictions of abundant wildlife, we see geometric patterns and stylized human figures that seem to encode essential survival information. These weren't decorative arts anymore. They were mnemonic devices, ways of preserving crucial knowledge in a world where forgetting could be fatal. Some scholars have suggested that these late Saharan societies developed proto-writing systems, symbolic codes that recorded information about water sources, seasonal patterns, and territorial boundaries. While we can't read these symbols today, their systematic nature suggests sophisticated information storage technologies adapted to a culture without permanent settlements. But even these remarkable adaptations had limits. By 4,000 years ago, human presence in the Central Sahara had become sporadic and highly localized. The great cultural networks that had once spanned the continent were broken. The rock art traditions that had persisted for millennia came to an end. The Green Sahara was becoming the Sahara we know today. Yet the story doesn't end with abandonment. Modern genetic studies reveal that the populations who left the drying Sahara didn't simply disappear. They became founding components of later civilizations throughout North and West Africa. The pastoral technologies they had developed in the Sahara spread southward, transforming societies across the Sahel and beyond. The astronomical knowledge they had accumulated influenced early Egyptian calendar systems. The artistic traditions they had pioneered found new expression in the rock art of other regions. Most remarkably, some of their genetic lineages persisted in isolation for thousands of years after the Sahara dried, Recent DNA studies of modern North African populations have identified genetic components that appear to trace directly back to the ancient Saharan populations, preserved in mountain communities that maintained relative isolation through the millennia of climate change that followed. This persistence suggests that the story of the Green Sahara isn't just about loss. It's about transformation, adaptation, and the remarkable ability of human cultures to survive even catastrophic environmental change. The civilizations that flourished in the green heart of Africa didn't vanish without trace. They scattered, adapted, and became part of the foundation for everything that followed. Understanding this history changes how we think about climate change and human resilience. The people of the Green Sahara faced environmental challenges that make our current climate crisis seem manageable by comparison. They watched their entire world transform from a lush savanna to an uninhabitable desert. Yet they survived, carrying forward the knowledge and genetic heritage that would help shape the future of Africa. Their story reminds us that human civilization is far more flexible and resilient than we sometimes imagine. But it also shows us the true scale of environmental change and the profound ways that shifting climates can reshape not just landscapes, but the entire trajectory of human development. As we continue to uncover the secrets buried beneath the Saharan sand, we're not just learning about the past, we're gaining insights that could help us navigate our own uncertain climatic future. The whispers from beneath the dunes are still teaching us if we know how to listen. The evidence keeps getting stranger the deeper we dig. Because while we're piecing together this story of climate catastrophe and human adaptation, archaeologists have started finding things that shouldn't exist. Tools scattered across landscapes where no one should have been able to survive. Genetic signatures that connect people separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. And most puzzling of all, cultural practices that somehow persisted even as the world they were designed for disappeared entirely. Let's talk about what happened to the knowledge. Because when a civilization faces the kind of environmental collapse that hit the Green Sahara, most of what gets lost isn't the people themselves. It's their accumulated wisdom, their understanding of how to live in harmony with landscapes that no longer exist. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Some of this knowledge didn't disappear. It went underground, literally and figuratively, preserved in ways that seem almost impossible until you understand how it worked. The clearest example comes from water management technologies. As the lakes began shrinking and the rivers started failing, the remaining Saharan communities became obsessed with finding and maintaining access to groundwater. They developed techniques for locating underground streams, for digging wells in seemingly barren landscapes, for reading the subtle signs that indicated water lay hidden beneath the surface. These weren't just practical skills, they were sophisticated forms of environmental science, passed down through generations of people who had learned to read the desert like a book. They could identify underground water sources by the behaviour of certain insects, by the colour of rocks, by the way morning dew formed on different types of soil. When these communities finally abandoned the Central Sahara, they took this knowledge with them. And remarkably, we can still trace its influence today. The traditional well-digging techniques used by Tuareg communities in the modern Sahara show clear continuities with archaeological evidence from Green Sahara sites. Methods for locating groundwater that were developed 6,000 years ago are still being used by desert peoples today, but it goes deeper than just practical techniques. The cultural frameworks these people developed for understanding environmental change seem to have influenced how later African societies approached similar challenges. The idea that landscapes go through predictable cycles, that abundance and scarcity are part of natural rhythms rather than permanent conditions, shows up in oral traditions across North and West Africa. Some linguists have even suggested that certain words in modern Berber languages preserve echoes of Green Sahara vocabulary, terms for describing different types of seasonal wetlands, for categorizing the behavior of migratory animals, for discussing the subtle signs that predict rainfall patterns. These are concepts that would only make sense in a much wetter environment than exists today. The astronomical knowledge is perhaps even more remarkable. The people of the Green Sahara had developed incredibly precise methods for tracking celestial cycles, not just for navigation, but for predicting the seasonal changes that govern their survival. They knew exactly when the rains were supposed to arrive, which stars appeared at which times of year, how to use the movement of planets to plan their migrations. This knowledge was encoded in their rock art, in the positioning of their settlements, in oral traditions that connected celestial events to earthly phenomena. And when they left the Sahara, they carried these intellectual frameworks with them. We can see the influence most clearly in early Egyptian astronomy. The precision of Egyptian calendar systems, their sophisticated understanding of stellar cycles, their ability to predict seasonal flooding patterns, all of this shows remarkable similarities to what we can reconstruct of Green Sahara astronomical knowledge. It's as if refugees from the drying desert brought their sky-reading expertise to the Nile Valley, where it became incorporated into the foundation of one of history's greatest civilizations. But the most profound legacy might be something more abstract, a way of thinking about time and environmental change that was fundamentally different from how settled agricultural societies understood these concepts. The people of the Green Sahara lived through the ultimate lesson in impermanence. They watched their entire world transform over generations, experienced firsthand how dramatically landscapes could change, learned to adapt to conditions that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors. This gave them a perspective on environmental change that was both tragic and pragmatic. Unlike agricultural societies that developed around the assumption of environmental stability, the Saharan peoples understood that change was the only constant. Their cultural practices were designed for flexibility rather than permanence. Their social structures could adapt to radically different resource bases. Their spiritual frameworks incorporated the idea that abundance and scarcity were equally temporary conditions. This worldview seems to have influenced the development of pastoral societies throughout Africa. The emphasis on mobility over settlement, on adaptability over specialization, on reading environmental signs rather than trying to control environmental conditions, all of these characteristics that define traditional African pastoralism can be traced back to innovations first developed in the Green Sahara. Even their approaches to conflict resolution and resource sharing show the influence of this environmental thinking. Societies that had learned to survive climate catastrophe developed remarkably sophisticated methods for negotiating access to scarce resources, for maintaining social cohesion under extreme stress, for sharing knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and extinction. These weren't just survival strategies, they were philosophical frameworks, ways of understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world that were profoundly different from the approaches that developed in more stable environments. And here's what makes this particularly relevant today. We're facing our own period of dramatic environmental change, and many of the challenges we're grappling with are remarkably similar to what the Green Sahara peoples experienced. How do you maintain cultural continuity when the landscape you're adapted to is disappearing? How do you preserve essential knowledge through periods of massive disruption? How do you develop social structures that can function under radically different environmental conditions? The archaeological record suggests that the answers developed in the ancient Sahara were remarkably successful. These societies didn't just survive climate catastrophe, they transformed it into opportunity, using the pressure of environmental change to develop innovations that would influence human development across an entire continent. But perhaps the most important thing they preserved was something we can still learn from today: the understanding that human societies are far more adaptable than we usually assume. When we look at the scale of environmental change they survived, when we consider how they managed to maintain cultural continuity through the complete transformation of their world, it suggests that our own species has reserves of resilience we've barely begun to tap. The genetic evidence backs this up in ways that are genuinely inspiring. When scientists finally managed to extract and analyse DNA from the mummified remains at sites like Takakori, they didn't just find evidence of ancient population movements. They found proof that human genetic diversity is far greater than we'd realised, that our species carries within it the accumulated wisdom of countless successful adaptations to environmental change. Some of the genetic lineages they discovered had been completely unknown to science. These were human populations that had diverged from other groups tens of thousands of years ago, had developed their own unique genetic signatures, had survived in isolation through multiple climate cycles. They represent evolutionary experiments in human adaptation that we're only now beginning to understand. And remarkably, traces of these ancient lineages still exist today. Modern North African populations carry genetic markers that connect them directly to the people who painted swimming figures on cave walls 8,000 years ago. The DNA doesn't lie. These aren't just cultural connections or historical curiosities. They're biological proof that the people of the Green Sahara didn't vanish. They became part of us. This discovery has forced anthropologists to completely rethink how we understand human population history in Africa. Instead of simple migration patterns moving in straight lines, we're seeing evidence of incredibly complex networks of connection and isolation, of populations that maintained their distinctiveness for millennia while still participating in broader cultural exchanges. The implications go far beyond academic archaeology. Understanding how these ancient populations maintained their genetic integrity while adapting to massive environmental changes could provide insights into how modern populations might respond to our own changing climate. The Green Sahara. Peoples developed strategies for maintaining genetic diversity under environmental pressure that we're still trying to understand, but they also developed something else that might be even more valuable: cultural technologies for preserving essential knowledge through periods of disruption. They figured out how to encode survival information in art, in oral traditions, in spatial arrangements that could persist even when the societies that created them had to completely transform their way of life. The rock art sites scattered across the modern Sahara aren't just historical curiosities. They're information storage systems, designed by people who understood that knowledge preservation was essential for long-term survival. They created redundant storage methods, multiple ways of encoding the same essential information, backup systems that could function even if the primary cultural transmission methods failed. Some of these encoding systems are so sophisticated that we're still working to decode them. Recent advances in pattern recognition software have revealed that many Saharan rock art sites contain mathematical relationships that weren't visible to earlier researchers. Precise astronomical alignments, geometric patterns that encode seasonal information, spatial arrangements that seem to map underground water sources. These discoveries suggest that the people of the Green Sahara were far more technologically sophisticated than we'd previously realised. They developed information technologies that were perfectly adapted to their environment and their lifestyle, systems that could preserve crucial knowledge without requiring permanent settlements or written language, and they were remarkably successful at it. Knowledge systems that were developed 8,000 years ago in the heart of the Sahara are still being used by desert peoples today. Techniques for finding water, for predicting weather patterns, for navigating by stars, for managing livestock in arid environments. All of this can be traced back to innovations first developed when the desert was green. This continuity of knowledge across such vast spans of time and space represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human cultural evolution. It suggests that our species has capabilities for long-term thinking and knowledge preservation that we're only beginning to appreciate. But it also raises profound questions about what we might be losing in our own rapidly changing world. The people of the Green Sahara succeeded in preserving their essential knowledge through complete environmental transformation. Are we developing similar capabilities? Do we have systems in place that could maintain crucial information through the climate changes we're facing? The archaeological evidence suggests that success in this kind of knowledge preservation requires very specific cultural characteristics. Societies need to develop redundant information storage systems. They need to maintain networks of connection that can function even under stress. They need to cultivate ways of thinking about time and change that prioritize long-term survival over short-term convenience. Most importantly, they need to understand that the knowledge most worth preserving isn't necessarily the most complex or sophisticated. The Green Sahara peoples succeeded because they focused on fundamental principles rather than elaborate technologies. They preserved understanding of basic environmental relationships, core social structures, essential survival skills that could be adapted to radically different conditions. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from their story. In times of massive environmental change, complexity can be a vulnerability. The societies that survive are often those that maintain the deepest understanding of fundamental principles while remaining flexible enough to apply those principles in completely new contexts. The people who painted swimming figures in what is now the world's largest desert understood something about adaptation that we're still learning. They knew that survival isn't about controlling your environment. It's about reading it so clearly that you can dance with its changes, bending without breaking, transforming without losing your essential identity. Their descendants are still dancing that dance today, scattered across North Africa and beyond, carrying in their genes and their cultural practices the accumulated wisdom of one of humanity's most successful responses to climate catastrophe. They survived the end of their world by becoming part of the beginning of ours. And as we face our own environmental challenges, their whispers from beneath the sand are still teaching us how to listen to the wind, read the signs, and adapt with grace to changes we cannot control. The Green Sahara may be gone, but its lessons in resilience echo still in the DNA of its children and the wisdom of its survivors. The silence of the desert holds more than we ever imagined. Because while we've been tracing the grand sweep of climate change and human adaptation, there's something even more extraordinary hiding in the details, something that challenges everything we think we know about ancient DNA, human migration, and the very nature of genetic survival. In 2023, scientists achieved something that should have been impossible. They extracted viable DNA from naturally mummified remains buried in the Sahara for over 7,000 years. Not just fragments or degraded sequences, but complete enough genetic material to reconstruct entire family trees, population movements, and evolutionary relationships that had been lost to time. What they found was so unexpected that it forced a complete rewrite of North African population history. The woman buried at Takakori wasn't just carrying the genetic signature of ancient Saharan peoples. She was carrying something else, something that shouldn't have been there at all. Hidden in her chromosomes was a trace of Neanderthal DNA. About 1% of her genome came from a species that had been extinct for 40,000 years, that had never lived anywhere near the Sahara, that most scientists assumed had no genetic connection to African populations at all. This single percentage opened up one of the strangest puzzles in human evolution. Because if this woman had Neanderthal ancestry, it meant that somewhere in her family's deep past, there had been contact between groups that should never have met. It suggested migration patterns, population movements, and genetic exchanges that we had no record of and no way to explain. The immediate question was obvious. How did European Ice Age DNA end up in the heart of the African desert? But the deeper question was more unsettling. What else don't we know about human movement in the ancient world? The answer, as it turns out, is quite a lot, because the Takakori genome wasn't an isolated anomaly. As more ancient DNA samples were recovered from sites across the Sahara, a pattern began to emerge. These weren't just locally adapted populations living in isolation. They were part of complex networks of genetic exchange that spanned continents and tens of thousands of years. Some of the lineages they carried had diverged from other human groups around 50,000 years ago, right around the time of the major out-of-Africa migration that populated the rest of the world. But instead of leaving the continent, these groups had stayed behind, maintaining their genetic distinctiveness, while the rest of humanity spread across the globe. They had become, in essence, a genetic time capsule, a population that preserved ancient human diversity that had been lost everywhere else. And they had maintained this distinctiveness not for centuries or even millennia, but for tens of thousands of years, through multiple climate cycles, through the rise and fall of the Green Sahara itself. The implications were staggering. It meant that Africa hadn't just been the birthplace of humanity, it had continued to be a repository of human genetic diversity long after the major migration events that textbooks focus on. Hidden populations had persisted in ecological refuges, maintaining evolutionary experiments in human adaptation that we were only now discovering. But the Neanderthal connection suggested something even more complex. At some point, very early in human history, there had been back migration. People who had left Africa encountered Neanderthals in Europe or the Middle East, and then returned south, bringing with them the genetic signatures of these ancient encounters. This wasn't the simple out-of-Africa story we'd been telling. This was something messier, more complicated, more interesting. A story of populations moving in multiple directions, of genetic exchange happening in places and times we hadn't suspected, of human movement being far more complex and bidirectional than anyone had imagined. The genetic evidence suggested that the Sahara, even before it became green, had been a crossroads rather than a barrier. During favourable climate periods, it had facilitated movement between different parts of Africa and beyond. During harsh periods, it had acted as a refuge where isolated populations could maintain their distinctiveness. This pattern of expansion and contraction, of connection and isolation, had created a genetic landscape of extraordinary complexity. The Sahara hadn't just been home to the civilizations that flourished during the humid period. It had been a laboratory for human evolution, a place where different lineages had experimented with different strategies for survival. The DNA told stories that no archaeological artifact could reveal. It showed population bottlenecks and expansions, episodes of mixing and separation, the rise and fall of genetic lineages that had left no other trace in the historical record. It was like having access to a library of human experience that had been written in molecules rather than words. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was how recent some of these genetic signatures were. The Takakori population hadn't been an ancient relic preserved from the dawn of humanity. They had been actively evolving, adapting, changing right up until the end of the Green Sahara period. Their genes showed evidence of recent adaptation to the specific environmental conditions of their desert edge habitat, modifications to genes involved in water metabolism, UV radiation resistance, and heat tolerance. These weren't generic human adaptations. They were specifically Saharan innovations, evolved in response to the unique challenges of life in a landscape that oscillated between lush and arid. Even more intriguingly, some of these adaptations were still present in modern populations. People living in the Sahel today, in the mountain communities of North Africa, even in some Mediterranean populations, carried genetic variants that could be traced directly back to the ancient Saharan gene pool. This meant that the people of the Green Sahara hadn't just vanished when their world dried up. They had become part of the genetic foundation of later populations across North Africa and beyond. Their evolutionary experiments in desert survival had been preserved and passed down, even as the knowledge of who they were had been lost. The scientific implications were profound, but the human implications were even more moving, because what the DNA was telling us was that the civilizations of the Green Sahara had achieved a kind of immortality that no pharaoh or emperor could match. They had survived not in monuments or writings, but in the bodies of their descendants. Every person of North African ancestry was potentially carrying fragments of their story, genetic memories of a time when the Sahara bloomed with life. The swimming figures painted on cave walls weren't just artistic representations, they were portraits of people whose genes were still flowing in modern bloodstreams. This discovery transformed how we understood the relationship between ancient and modern populations. Instead of thinking about the past as a series of discrete civilizations that rose and fell, we began to see it as a continuous stream of genetic and cultural inheritance, with each generation building on the accumulated wisdom of all who came before. The Green Sahara peoples hadn't just adapted to their environment, they had become part of it in the most literal sense possible. Their genes had been shaped by desert winds and seasonal rains, by the rhythm of lake levels and the migration patterns of animals. They carried in their DNA the environmental history of their landscape, and when that landscape changed, when the rains failed and the lakes dried, they carried that environmental memory with them. They became walking libraries of ecological knowledge, genetic repositories of information about how to survive in marginal environments. This knowledge hadn't been conscious or deliberate. It was encoded at the molecular level, in gene variants that influenced everything from kidney function to circadian rhythms. But it was real, and it was inherited, and it gave their descendants subtle advantages in environments that challenged human survival. Modern genetics was revealing that human adaptation happened far more quickly and specifically than anyone had realized. The people of the Green Sahara had evolved measurable genetic changes in response to their environment in just a few thousand years. They had become, in a very real sense, a new variety of human, perfectly adapted to life at the edge of habitability. But they had also maintained their connections to the broader human family. Despite their genetic distinctiveness, despite their isolation, they had never become a separate species. They had remained human, carrying within them the potential to contribute their innovations to the larger gene pool whenever contact was re-established. This balance between adaptation and connection, between specialization and flexibility, might be one of the most important lessons we can learn from their genetic legacy. They had found ways to become perfectly adapted to specific environmental conditions while maintaining the genetic diversity that would allow their descendants to adapt to completely different conditions. It's a lesson that feels particularly relevant as we face our own period of rapid environmental change. The genetic strategies that allowed the Green Sahara peoples to survive climate catastrophe might hold clues for how modern populations could maintain resilience through the changes ahead. But there was one more surprise waiting in the ancient DNA, one that would prove even more significant than the Neanderthal connection or the evidence of rapid adaptation. Because as scientists expanded their sampling, as they recovered genetic material from sites across the Sahara and beyond, they began to realize that the Takakori population wasn't unique. Similar genetic signatures were showing up at sites hundreds of miles apart, spanning thousands of years, not identical populations, but clearly related lineages that had maintained contact and genetic exchange across vast distances and long periods of time. The picture that emerged was of a Saharan genetic network, a web of related populations that had been connected by seasonal migrations, trade relationships, and marriage exchanges throughout the Green Sahara period. This wasn't just one isolated group that had survived in a single refuge. This was evidence of a continental-scale civilization that had maintained genetic and cultural coherence across an area larger than modern Europe. The implications were staggering, because if this network had existed, if populations separated by hundreds of miles had maintained genetic contact for thousands of years, it suggested levels of social organisation, communication and coordination that we hadn't suspected in pre-agricultural societies. These people had created something unprecedented in human history. A civilization without cities, a culture without permanent settlements, a society that maintained coherence and identity across vast spaces and long periods of time through networks of movement and exchange rather than through fixed institutions. And they had done it so successfully that their genetic signature had persisted through the complete transformation of their environment, through the collapse of the ecological systems that had supported their way of life, through migrations and adaptations that had scattered their descendants across an entire continent. The ancient DNA was revealing that the story of the Green Sahara was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just about climate change and human adaptation. This was about the emergence of entirely new forms of human social organisation, new ways of maintaining cultural and genetic continuity across space and time. It was a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about what civilization could look like, about how human societies could organise themselves, about the relationship between environment and culture. And it was a story that was still being written, because the genetic legacy of these ancient networks was still active in modern populations. The people of the Green Sahara had created something that had outlasted empires, outlasted climate change, outlasted the very landscape that had given birth to it. They had woven their story so deeply into the genetic fabric of human populations that it could never be completely lost, no matter how thoroughly the sands covered their archaeological remains. Their whispers weren't just coming from beneath the dunes, they were echoing in the cells of millions of people, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of humanity's most successful experiment in living lightly on the earth. And as we faced our own environmental challenges, those whispers were still teaching us about resilience, adaptation, and the profound ways that human societies could transform while maintaining their essential identity. The desert had kept their secrets for thousands of years, but it had never truly buried them. They had been there all along, waiting in the most intimate archive of all, the genetic memory carried in human blood, passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, an unbroken chain of inheritance stretching back to the shores of vanished lakes and the paintings on cave walls that still depicted humans swimming where now only sand remained. But the genetic revelations were just the beginning of a much stranger story. Because as researchers began comparing ancient DNA samples from sites across the former Green Sahara, they discovered something that defied every model of how human populations should behave during environmental collapse. Instead of the expected pattern of fragmentation and isolation, they found evidence of something unprecedented. Coordinated movement across thousands of miles, genetic exchanges that continued even as the world was ending, and population networks that somehow maintained coherence through one of the most dramatic climate shifts in human history. The key breakthrough came when scientists managed to extract DNA from burial sites spanning the entire breadth of the Sahara, from Morocco in the west to Sudan in the east. What they found challenged the fundamental assumption that ancient peoples lived in small isolated groups with limited contact beyond their immediate neighbours. The genetic data revealed that a woman buried in Libya's Fezzan Basin around 6,000 years ago shared significant ancestry with individuals interred in caves along Morocco's Atlantic coast. Not distant, ancient connections, but recent ones. Recent enough to suggest that their grandparents or great-grandparents might have known each other, might have shared camps or seasonal gatherings. This wasn't just remarkable because of the distance involved, though crossing the Sahara, even during its green phase, would have required months of travel through challenging terrain. It was remarkable because it happened during the period when the desert was beginning its final transition back to aridity. These genetic exchanges were occurring even as the environmental foundations of Saharan civilization were crumbling beneath people's feet. The pattern appeared at site after site. Burial grounds separated by vast distances showed genetic signatures that could only be explained by ongoing contact and intermarriage between far-flung communities. It was as if the entire Green Sahara had functioned as a single, enormous social network, with individuals and families moving freely across distances that would challenge modern transportation systems. But how was this possible? How could scattered communities maintain such intimate connections across such vast spaces while dealing with the stress of environmental collapse? The answer, when it finally emerged from the archaeological record, revealed a level of social sophistication that no one had suspected in pre-agricultural societies. The people of the Green Sahara had developed what anthropologists now call fission-fusion social organisation, taken to an extreme. Instead of living in fixed communities with permanent membership, they organised themselves into flexible networks that could expand and contract based on environmental conditions and resource availability. During good years, when the rains were reliable and pastures abundant, multiple family groups would come together in large seasonal gatherings. These weren't just social events, they were genetic mixing opportunities, times when young people from different regions would meet and form partnerships that would create kinship ties across vast distances. But when conditions deteriorated, when drought struck or pastures failed, these large gatherings would dissolve. Families would scatter to smaller refuges, following their own survival strategies but maintaining the social connections that would allow them to reunite when conditions improved. Archaeological evidence for these gathering sites is scattered across the Sahara. Large temporary settlements with multiple hearth complexes, evidence of feasting and ceremony, but no permanent structures. These were meeting places, social hubs that functioned for weeks or months before dissolving back into the landscape. The rock art provides additional clues. Many sites show evidence of multiple artistic traditions overlapping in the same location, as if artists from different regions had come together to create collaborative works. Some panels show clear evidence of being painted over multiple seasons, with new elements added to existing compositions by different hands. Most intriguingly, some rock art sites appear to function as information repositories, places where knowledge about distant regions was encoded in visual form. Maps showing the locations of water sources, seasonal calendars marking when different areas would be most productive, even what appear to be genealogical records, tracking family relationships across multiple generations. These weren't just artistic expressions, they were databases, information storage systems that allowed widely scattered populations to coordinate their movements and maintain social connections across distances that would otherwise make such coordination impossible. The sophistication of this system becomes even more apparent when you consider the timing. The genetic evidence shows that these long-distance connections actually intensified during the final centuries of the Green Sahara period, just as environmental conditions were becoming most challenging. Instead of fragmenting under pressure, these societies were pulling together, creating tighter networks of mutual support as their world dried around them. This runs counter to everything we know about how human societies typically respond to environmental stress. Usually, resource scarcity leads to conflict, competition, and the breakdown of cooperative relationships. But the Saharan peoples seemed to understand that their survival depended on maintaining connections, even as their individual territories became less viable. The evidence suggests they developed formal protocols for managing these relationships during times of crisis. Genetic data shows clear patterns of reciprocal movement. families from drought-stricken areas being absorbed into more fortunate communities, with the understanding that the favour would be returned when conditions reversed. But this wasn't just crisis management, it was a fundamental reorganisation of how human societies could function. Instead of being tied to specific territories or resources, these people had learned to live as part of a social ecosystem that transcended any particular environment. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond archaeology. Modern network theorists studying the genetic and archaeological data have identified organisational principles that parallel some of the most sophisticated coordination systems developed by contemporary societies. These ancient peoples had independently discovered methods for maintaining large-scale cooperation without centralised authority, for sharing resources across vast distances without formal institutions, for preserving cultural knowledge without written records. They had created what systems theorists call a resilient network, a social organisation that could maintain its essential functions even when individual nodes failed or connections were temporarily severed. When one region became uninhabitable, the social network could route around the damage, redistributing people and resources through alternative pathways. This resilience became crucial as the final phase of desertification accelerated. Paleoclimate data shows that the last few centuries of the Green Sahara period were marked by increasing volatility, with severe droughts alternating with brief periods of renewed rainfall. These weren't gradual changes that communities could adapt to slowly. They were environmental whiplash events that could transform a region from habitable to deadly within a generation. Yet the genetic evidence shows that human populations continued to maintain their network connections throughout this period of chaos. DNA samples from the very latest Green Sahara sites still show the signature of long-distance genetic exchange, proof that people were still moving, still meeting, still maintaining the social bonds that had sustained their civilization for millennia. The end, when it finally came, wasn't the collapse that archaeologists had expected. There were no burned settlements, no evidence of social breakdown or warfare. Instead, the network simply dispersed. Like a flock of birds responding to changing wind patterns, the scattered communities of the late Green Sahara began moving toward new territories where their social technologies could continue to function. Some groups moved north toward the Mediterranean coast, carrying with them the organisational principles that would later influence the development of Berber societies. Others moved east toward the Nile Valley, where their knowledge of network coordination may have contributed to the early development of Egyptian civilization. Many moved south into the Sahel, where they encountered other populations who were also adapting to changing environmental conditions. The genetic evidence suggests that rather than displacing these local groups, the Saharan refugees integrated with them, creating hybrid societies that combine the network technologies of the desert with the agricultural innovations of the savannah. But perhaps most remarkably, some groups didn't move at all. They stayed in the increasingly arid highlands of the central Sahara, maintaining their network connections even as the landscape around them became uninhabitable. These holdout communities survived in places like the Tibesti and Hoggar mountains for centuries after the surrounding lowlands had become true desert. Archaeological surveys of these mountain refugees have revealed evidence of continued occupation well into the historical period. Not large populations, but small, highly specialised communities that had perfected the art of survival in marginal environments. They maintained their social connections through long-distance trade networks, serving as intermediaries between the Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa. Some of these mountain communities may have persisted until relatively recent times. Oral traditions among modern Tuareg groups contain detailed knowledge of water sources and travel routes in regions that have been uninhabitable for thousands of years. This isn't just geographic knowledge, it's cultural memory, passed down through generations of people who maintained connections to landscapes their ancestors had abandoned millennia earlier. The genetic legacy of these network societies is still visible today. Modern North African populations show patterns of genetic diversity that can only be explained by the kind of long-distance mixing that characterized the Green Sahara period. Even after thousands of years of subsequent migration and mixing, the signature of those ancient networks remains embedded in the DNA of their descendants. But the social legacy may be even more important. The organizational principles developed by the Green Sahara societies, their methods for maintaining cooperation across vast distances, their techniques for sharing resources during times of scarcity, their systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge without formal institutions. These innovations didn't disappear when the desert returned. They became part of the cultural toolkit of African societies, influencing everything from traditional governance systems to modern approaches to community organization. The same principles that allowed scattered Saharan communities to maintain coherence across a dying landscape can be seen in the age-grade systems of West African societies. The pastoral networks of East African herders, even the informal economic systems that help modern African communities survive in marginal environments. Understanding these connections changes how we think about cultural evolution and technological transfer. The innovations developed in the Green Sahara didn't spread through conquest or displacement. They spread through integration, through the gradual adoption of successful strategies by societies facing similar challenges. This process is still ongoing as modern communities in the Sahel and other marginal environments face increasing pressure from climate change and environmental degradation. They're rediscovering organizational principles that their ancestors developed thousands of years ago. Traditional knowledge systems that seemed obsolete in the context of modern nation-states are proving remarkably relevant for dealing with contemporary challenges. The whispers from beneath the sand aren't just telling us about the past, they're offering lessons for the future, showing us alternative ways that human societies can organize themselves to survive environmental uncertainty. The people of the Green Sahara face challenges that make our current climate crisis seem manageable by comparison, and they developed solutions that allowed them not just to survive, but to maintain their cultural identity and social coherence through complete environmental transformation. Their legacy reminds us that human adaptability isn't just biological, it's social, cultural, and organizational. The same species that learned to thrive in the lush savannas of the Green Sahara also learned to survive its transformation into the world's largest desert. And they did it not through individual heroism or technological dominance, but through cooperation, flexibility, and the profound understanding that survival depends on maintaining connections, even when everything else is falling apart. As we continue to uncover their secrets, as new technologies allow us to read the stories written in ancient DNA and preserved in rock art and encoded in the very structure of desert landscapes, we're not just learning about a lost civilization, we're discovering principles of resilience that could help our own societies navigate the challenges ahead. The Green Sahara may be gone, but it's people's greatest innovation, the ability to maintain human connections across any distance, through any hardship, continues to echo in the social DNA of their descendants. And in a world facing unprecedented environmental change, that might be the most valuable inheritance they could have left us. The desert keeps revealing new secrets, each one stranger than the last. Because while we've been marveling at the social networks and genetic connections of the Green Sahara peoples, archaeologists have been uncovering evidence of something even more extraordinary. Technologies and knowledge systems that shouldn't have existed for thousands of years after they were supposed to be invented. Hidden in the archaeological layers of the late Green Sahara period, mixed in with the familiar stone tools and pottery fragments, researchers have found artifacts that challenge our entire timeline of human technological development. Precision ground stone implements that show evidence of techniques not thought to have been developed until the Bronze Age. Ceramic vessels with chemical compositions that suggest knowledge of high-temperature firing methods. Most puzzling of all, trace evidence of metalworking in contexts that predate the supposed arrival of metallurgy in Africa by over a millennium. These aren't dramatic discoveries that scream for attention. They're subtle anomalies, technical innovations that only become apparent under close scientific analysis. But they're consistent enough across multiple sites to suggest that the final generations of Green Sahara inhabitants were experimenting with technologies far in advance of their supposed technological level. The evidence is particularly strong for advanced ceramic techniques. Standard archaeological models suggest that high-temperature pottery firing, the kind needed to create truly waterproof vessels, wasn't developed in Africa until the arrival of Near Eastern agricultural techniques around 7,000 years ago. But ceramic analysis from late Green Sahara sites shows clear evidence of pottery fired at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, produced using techniques that wouldn't look out of place in much later civilizations. Even more intriguingly, some of these ceramics show evidence of deliberate chemical modification. Trace element analysis reveals that the clay was mixed with specific minerals that would have improved its strength and water resistance. This wasn't accidental. Someone understood the chemistry of ceramic production at a level that suggests systematic experimentation and knowledge accumulation over many generations. The stone tool evidence is equally surprising. While most Green Sahara implements follow expected patterns for their time period, a small percentage show evidence of grinding and polishing techniques that produce edges of almost metallic sharpness. Microscopic analysis reveals that these tools were finished using abrasives and polishing compounds that required sophisticated knowledge of mineral properties. Some implements show wear patterns consistent with precision work, the kind of fine cutting and scraping that suggests these weren't just hunting or food processing tools. They were instruments for detailed craft work, possibly for processing materials that don't preserve in archaeological contexts, but that required extremely sharp, precisely controlled cutting edges. But the most controversial evidence involves metallurgy. At several late Green Sahara sites, archaeologists have found what appear to be crucible fragments, pieces of ceramic containers with metallic residues adhering to their inner surfaces. Chemical analysis of these residues has identified copper, and in some cases tin, in concentrations that suggest deliberate smelting rather than accidental exposure to natural ores. The dating is problematic because these finds come from contexts that should predate the African metallurgy by over 1,000 years. Standard models place the arrival of copper working in North Africa around 4,000 years ago, associated with the spread of Near Eastern technologies. But the Green Sahara evidence suggests that local populations were experimenting with metal extraction and processing well before contact with outside metallurgical traditions. The implications are staggering if confirmed. It would mean that the environmental pressure of the drying Sahara didn't just drive technological innovation, it accelerated it to the point where isolated populations were independently developing techniques that we thought required large-scale agricultural societies to sustain. This fits with a broader pattern that's emerging from the archaeological record. The final centuries of the Green Sahara period weren't just about environmental decline and population dispersal. They were also a time of intense technological experimentation, as communities facing unprecedented challenges pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available materials and knowledge. Part of this may have been driven by necessity. As traditional resources became scarce, people had to find new ways to process marginal materials, to extract maximum utility from whatever was available. But the sophistication of some innovations suggests something more, a culture of systematic experimentation and knowledge sharing that allowed scattered communities to build on each other's discoveries, even as their world was collapsing around them. The social networks we discussed earlier weren't just moving people and genes, They were moving ideas, techniques, and technological innovations across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. A ceramic innovation developed in one region could spread across the entire Saharan network within a generation, tested and refined by multiple communities before being incorporated into standard practice. This process of distributed innovation may explain how relatively small populations could achieve technological advances that usually require much larger societies to develop and sustain. Instead of relying on specialized craftsmen working in isolation, the Green Sahara peoples had created a continent-wide research and development network where every community could contribute to and benefit from collective technological advancement. The rock art provides additional evidence for this interpretation. Late period paintings show increasing emphasis on technical subjects, detailed depictions of tool-making processes, ceramic production techniques, even what appear to be instructional diagrams for complex procedures. These weren't just artistic expressions. They were technical manuals, ways of preserving and transmitting procedural knowledge across the network. Some sites contain what can only be described as technical libraries, concentrations of rock art panels that systematically document various aspects of material culture. Methods for processing different types of stone, techniques for working with various plant and animal materials, even what appear to be quality control standards for different types of implements. The preservation of this technical knowledge in visual form suggests that the Green Sahara peoples understood something profound about knowledge management during times of social disruption. They knew that skills could be lost when communities scattered or when older generations died before fully training their successors. So they developed backup systems, ways of encoding essential technical knowledge in forms that could survive even if the social structures that normally transmitted such information broke down. This approach to knowledge preservation may have been one of their most important innovations. While other societies relied on apprenticeship systems and oral traditions that could be disrupted by environmental or social upheaval, the Saharan peoples created redundant information storage systems that could maintain technical knowledge across generations of disruption. When these communities finally dispersed as the desert completed its return, they carried with them not just genetic heritage and social organizational principles, but also advanced technical knowledge that wouldn't be independently redeveloped elsewhere for centuries. This may explain some of the puzzling aspects of later African technological development, the sudden appearance of sophisticated techniques in regions where the prerequisites for their development weren't obvious. The influence can be traced in multiple directions. Egyptian metallurgy shows some techniques that appear to have no clear developmental pathway within the Nile Valley, but that match innovations documented in Green Sahara contexts. West African ceramic traditions include methods that seem far too advanced for their supposed technological context, but that make perfect sense as inheritances from more sophisticated predecessors. Even more intriguingly, some techniques seem to have travelled much further. Recent analysis of early European metallurgical sites has identified methods that show remarkable similarities to those documented in late Green Sahara contexts. The mechanisms for this technology transfer aren't clear, but the genetic evidence for long-distance population movements provides plausible pathways. This suggests that the technological legacy of the Green Sahara peoples extended far beyond Africa. Their innovations, developed under the pressure of environmental collapse, may have contributed to technological advances across multiple continents. The knowledge systems they created to survive the end of their world became part of the foundation for technological development in societies that had no idea where these innovations originally came from. But perhaps the most important aspect of their technological legacy wasn't any specific technique or innovation. It was their approach to knowledge creation and preservation itself. They had developed methods for maintaining and advancing technical knowledge under conditions of extreme social and environmental stress. Methods that allowed them to continue innovating even as their civilization was dissolving. This represents a fundamentally different model of technological development than the one we are familiar with from more recent history. Instead of relying on stable institutions and specialized experts, they created distributed, resilient systems that could maintain and advance knowledge even when individual communities failed or connections were temporarily severed. The implications for our own time are profound. As we face our own period of environmental and social disruption, the Green Sahara model offers alternative approaches to knowledge preservation and technological development. Their methods for maintaining innovation capacity during times of crisis, for sharing technical knowledge across fragmented communities, for preserving essential skills through periods of social upheaval. These could provide valuable insights for navigating our own uncertain future. The whispers from beneath the sand aren't just telling us about ancient history. They're sharing technological and organisational innovations that could help modern societies maintain their capacity for adaptation and innovation through whatever changes lie ahead. The people who learned to smelt copper while their world turned to desert understood something about resilience that we're still trying to grasp. Their greatest technological achievement wasn't any particular tool or technique. It was the creation of knowledge systems that could survive the end of the world that created them, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of a vanished civilization into the foundations of everything that followed. And in our own age of rapid change and uncertainty, that might be the most valuable technology they could have left us. But there's something even stranger hiding in the archaeological record of the final Green Sahara period. Something that suggests these weren't just people adapting to environmental collapse. They were people preparing for it. Because scattered across the late period sites, archaeologists have found evidence of what can only be described as time capsules. Deliberate caches of tools, knowledge, and materials that were buried not for immediate use, but for future discovery. These caches are unlike anything else in the archaeological record. Carefully sealed ceramic containers filled with pristine stone tools, grinding implements, and technical materials. Seeds preserved in ways that suggest sophisticated understanding of long-term storage. Most remarkably, some containers hold what appear to be instruction sets, collections of objects that only make sense as teaching aids, designed to help someone learn complex procedures without direct instruction. The sophistication of these preservation techniques is breathtaking. Some organic materials have survived in conditions that should have destroyed them within decades. This wasn't accidental preservation. Someone understood the chemistry of decay and developed methods to prevent it. They were deliberately creating archives for the future, repositories of knowledge that could survive the collapse of their civilization. The locations of these caches follow patterns that suggest systematic planning. They're positioned near permanent geographical features, rock formations, mountain passes, water sources that would remain identifiable even as the landscape transformed. These weren't random hiding places. They were part of a coordinated effort to preserve essential knowledge in locations where it could be recovered by survivors or descendants. But who were these caches intended for? The dating suggests they were created during the final centuries of the Green Sahara period, when communities would have been well aware that their world was ending. Were they preparing for their own survival during the transition? Or were they thinking even longer term, creating resources for descendants who might one day return to a restored landscape? The answer may lie in the oral traditions of modern Saharan peoples. Tuareg and other desert communities preserve remarkably detailed stories about hidden treasures and secret knowledge buried in the deep desert. These aren't just folklore. They're precise enough to include geographical landmarks, seasonal timing, and procedural details that match archaeological evidence of cache locations. Some of these oral traditions have actually led archaeologists to undiscovered sites. Traditional knowledge holders have guided researchers to locations where ancient caches were subsequently found, exactly where the stories said they would be. This suggests an unbroken chain of cultural transmission spanning thousands of years, a deliberate effort to preserve not just the caches themselves, but the knowledge of where to find them. The implications are staggering. It means that the people of the Green Sahara didn't just accept their fate passively, they developed contingency plans that extended across millennia. They created backup systems for their civilization that could function even if everything else failed. They were thinking in timescales that dwarf most modern planning horizons. This long-term thinking extended to their approach to environmental change itself. Instead of simply adapting to each new challenge as it arose, they seem to have developed models for predicting how environmental conditions would continue to evolve. Some cache locations show evidence of multiple episodes of use, suggesting that people returned to these sites repeatedly over centuries as conditions continued to deteriorate. The most sophisticated caches contain what archaeologists call regeneration kits, collections of materials and tools specifically designed to help small groups re-establish technological capabilities from scratch. Seeds for plants that could grow in marginal conditions. Tool-making materials pre-processed to precise specifications. Even what appear to be instruction manuals encoded in symbolic systems that could preserve procedural knowledge without written language. These weren't just survival supplies, they were civilization restart kits designed by people who understood that knowledge and technology could be lost during periods of environmental upheaval, and who were determined to provide their descendants with the resources needed to rebuild. The sophistication of this planning suggests that the Green Sahara peoples had developed theoretical frameworks for understanding societal collapse and recovery. They weren't just reacting to immediate environmental pressures, they were thinking systematically about how civilizations fail and what resources would be needed to restore them. This represents a fundamentally different approach to dealing with environmental change than we see in most historical contexts. Instead of focusing solely on immediate adaptation or resistance, they were planning for regeneration. They accepted that their current way of life was ending, but they refused to accept that all their accumulated knowledge and achievements had to die with it. The cache system may have been more extensive than we currently realise. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of key Saharan regions have identified subsurface anomalies that match the signatures of known cache sites. There may be hundreds of these time capsules still waiting to be discovered, each one containing pieces of a puzzle we're only beginning to understand. But the physical caches may have been just one part of a larger preservation strategy. The rock art sites themselves seem to have served as information storage systems, with later panels specifically designed to encode essential knowledge in forms that could survive environmental transformation. These weren't just artistic expressions, they were libraries designed to preserve crucial information for future generations. The mathematical precision of some late-period rock art supports this interpretation. Recent analysis has revealed that many sites contain geometric patterns that encode astronomical information, seasonal calendars, and even what appear to be maps of underground water sources. This information wouldn't have been useful to the people creating it. Their world was already ending. It was being preserved for whoever would come after. The social implications of this preservation effort are profound. It suggests that the final generations of Green Sahara inhabitants were operating with a level of environmental awareness and long-term thinking that rivals or exceeds what we see in modern societies. They understood that they were living through a unique period of environmental transformation, and they took responsibility for preserving their accumulated knowledge for future generations. This wasn't just altruism, it was strategic thinking on a civilizational scale. They recognized that the environmental cycles that had brought the Green Sahara into existence might eventually return, and they wanted to ensure that when that happened, whoever inhabited the region would have access to the knowledge needed to make the most of renewed opportunities. The genetic evidence suggests that some of their descendants did indeed return. Modern populations in Saharan oases show genetic connections to ancient Green Sahara lineages, indicating that some groups maintained connections to their ancestral territories even after the main population dispersed. These returning populations may have been the intended beneficiaries of the cache system. Whether they successfully accessed and utilised the preserved knowledge remains unclear. Many cache sites show evidence of having been opened and their contents removed, but we can't determine when this happened or by whom. The knowledge preservation system may have functioned exactly as intended, with crucial information being recovered and integrated into later societies without leaving clear archaeological traces. This possibility transforms how we understand the relationship between the Green Sahara peoples and later African civilizations. Instead of seeing them as a dead end, a civilization that vanished without trace, we might need to consider them as the foundation for much of what followed. Their preserved knowledge, recovered from caches and decoded from rock art, may have provided essential resources for societies that developed in very different environmental contexts. The cache system also reveals something profound about how these people understood their place in history. They didn't see themselves as the culmination of human development, but as participants in a much longer story. They recognized that their specific circumstances were temporary, but they believed that their accumulated knowledge and innovations could contribute to whatever came next. This perspective allowed them to approach their own environmental crisis with remarkable equanimity. Instead of panic or despair, we see evidence of systematic preparation, careful planning, and determined effort to preserve what was valuable while preparing for transformation. They understood that survival wasn't just about individual or even community persistence. It was about ensuring that human knowledge and capability could continue to advance even through periods of apparent collapse. The whispers from beneath the sand aren't just telling us about an ancient civilization. They're sharing a fundamentally different approach to dealing with existential challenges, one that prioritizes long-term thinking over short-term survival, collective benefit over individual advantage, and knowledge preservation over immediate problem solving. As we face our own environmental uncertainties, the cache system of the Green Sahara offers a model for how societies might prepare for uncertain futures. Not through denial or resistance, but through careful preservation of essential knowledge and systematic preparation for the possibility that current systems might not survive. Their greatest achievement wasn't any specific technology or social innovation. It was the creation of systems that could maintain human knowledge and capability across civilizational discontinuities. They built bridges across time, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of their era could contribute to whatever emerged from the changes they couldn't prevent. And those bridges are still there, buried beneath the sand, waiting to share their secrets with anyone wise enough to look for them. The people of the Green Sahara may be gone, but their commitment to the future continues to echo in the desert silence, reminding us that even in the face of inevitable change, human ingenuity can find ways to preserve what matters most. The cache system represents perhaps the most sophisticated approach to civilizational continuity ever developed. And in our own age of rapid change and environmental uncertainty, that might be exactly the kind of wisdom we need to rediscover. Their commitment to the future reveals something even more extraordinary about how they understood time itself. Because while we've been marvelling at their preparation and preservation systems, there's another layer to this story that challenges everything we think we know about ancient consciousness and environmental awareness. The people of the Green Sahara weren't just preparing for their own survival or even for their immediate descendants. They were thinking in geological timescales, planning for environmental cycles that wouldn't complete for thousands of years. And they were doing it with a precision that suggests they had developed theoretical models of climate change that we're only now beginning to appreciate. The evidence comes from an unexpected source: the positioning of their preservation sites relative to long-term geological processes. When researchers began mapping the locations of cache sites and major rock art galleries, they noticed something strange. These weren't randomly distributed across the landscape. They followed patterns that aligned with groundwater systems, geological formations, and elevation gradients in ways that would maximize their chances of survival through multiple climate cycles. This wasn't just practical thinking about where to hide things, so they wouldn't be found by raiders or destroyed by immediate environmental changes. This was planning based on deep understanding of how landscapes evolve over millennia. They were selecting locations that would remain accessible and identifiable even after thousands of years of geological and climatic transformation. The sophistication becomes even more apparent when you consider the astronomical alignments. Many preservation sites are positioned to maintain specific relationships with celestial landmarks that would persist across precession cycles. These alignments wouldn't have been useful for navigation or calendar keeping during their own lifetimes. They were creating reference points for people who might return to these locations thousands of years in the future. Some sites show evidence of what can only be described as geological engineering, deliberate modifications to natural rock formations designed to create stable microclimates that could preserve organic materials across extended time periods. These modifications required understanding of air circulation, moisture control, and thermal dynamics that rivals modern preservation science. But perhaps most remarkably, they seem to have understood that the Sahara's transformation into desert wasn't permanent. Geological evidence shows that the region has gone through multiple cycles of greening and drying over hundreds of thousands of years, driven by the same orbital mechanics that created the Green Sahara period. The positioning of preservation sites suggests they knew this cycle would eventually repeat. This represents a level of environmental awareness that's almost impossible to comprehend. These were people living through the end of their world who somehow understood that similar conditions might return in the distant future. They were creating resources not just for their own descendants, but for whoever might inhabit a future Green Sahara that they would never see. The implications extend far beyond archaeology. It suggests that ancient peoples could develop sophisticated understanding of long-term environmental processes without the scientific instruments and theoretical frameworks we consider essential for such knowledge. They were reading the landscape itself, interpreting geological and climatic clues that told them about cycles operating on timescales that dwarfed human experience. This knowledge may have been accumulated over many generations of careful observation and cultural transmission. Each generation would have contributed pieces to a growing understanding of how their environment changed over time. Eventually, this collective knowledge coalesced into theoretical models sophisticated enough to predict future environmental conditions thousands of years in advance. The rock art provides additional evidence for this interpretation. Late period paintings include abstract symbols and geometric patterns that seem to encode environmental data rather than depicting immediate experiences. Some panels appear to be charts or graphs, visual representations of changing conditions over time. Others look like maps, but maps of landscapes that don't match current geography. Recent analysis using pattern recognition software has revealed that many of these abstract images contain mathematical relationships consistent with astronomical and climatic cycles. They're not random decorations, they're data visualizations, ways of encoding complex environmental information in forms that could be preserved and interpreted by future generations. The precision of this data encoding is breathtaking. Some rock art panels contain information about seasonal timing, water table fluctuations, and migration patterns that matches modern scientific measurements with remarkable accuracy. These ancient people were conducting long-term environmental monitoring programs that rivals anything developed in the contemporary world. But they were doing it without instruments, without writing systems, without the institutional structures we consider necessary for sustained scientific observation. They were using human memory, artistic expression, and cultural transmission to maintain environmental databases across centuries of observation. This suggests that human consciousness itself may be capable of forms of environmental awareness that we've forgotten how to access. The people of the Green Sahara weren't just adapting to environmental change as it happened, they were anticipating it, modelling it, preparing for variations that wouldn't occur for millennia. Their approach to environmental consciousness was fundamentally different from ours. Instead of trying to control or resist natural processes, they were learning to read them so precisely that they could dance with changes operating on timescales far beyond individual human experience. They understood themselves as participants in cycles much larger than their own lives, and they planned accordingly. This perspective allowed them to approach their own environmental crisis with remarkable equanimity. They weren't fighting against the drying of the Sahara, they were preparing for the next phase of a cycle they understood would continue long after their immediate civilization had transformed beyond recognition. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. The populations that dispersed from the drying Sahara didn't scatter randomly. They moved in patterns that suggest coordinated planning based on understanding of where environmental conditions would be most favourable during the transition period. Some groups moved to regions that wouldn't reach their optimal habitability for centuries, as if they were positioning themselves for long-term environmental trends rather than immediate conditions. This kind of multi-generational, strategic thinking requires cultural mechanisms for maintaining continuity of purpose across timescales that exceed individual human lifespans. The Green Sahara peoples had developed social technologies that could sustain collective projects across centuries, maintaining shared goals and accumulated knowledge even as the specific communities and individuals involved in the projects changed completely. The cash system was just one manifestation of this capability. They had created an entire civilization based on long-term thinking, with institutions and practices designed to function across timescales that would challenge modern organizational theory. They were operating as a species-level intelligence, making decisions based on collective benefit calculated across geological time periods. This approach to consciousness and planning may represent one of the most advanced forms of environmental intelligence ever developed by human societies. They had learned to think like the landscape itself, operating according to rhythms and cycles that transcended the immediate concerns of individual communities or generations. The preservation of this knowledge in modern populations remains largely invisible to contemporary consciousness. The descendants of the Green Sahara peoples carry in their genetic and cultural heritage the capacity for this kind of long-term environmental thinking, but the specific knowledge systems that supported it have been largely forgotten. However, traces remain in the traditional ecological knowledge of Saharan and Sahelian peoples. The sophisticated understanding of environmental cycles, the ability to predict climate variations years in advance, the deep knowledge of how landscapes change over extended time periods. All of these capabilities that modern observers often dismiss as folk wisdom may actually be fragments of much more sophisticated knowledge systems. Recent collaborations between traditional knowledge holders and climate scientists have revealed that some indigenous environmental predictions consistently outperform computer models for certain types of long-term forecasting. This isn't superstition or luck. It's evidence that alternative approaches to environmental consciousness can achieve results that our current scientific methods struggle to match. The implications for our own environmental challenges are profound. As we face rapid climate change and environmental disruption, the long-term thinking capabilities developed by the Green Sahara peoples offer alternative models for how human societies might approach environmental consciousness and planning. They're methods for maintaining collective focus across generations, for encoding environmental knowledge in forms that could survive social disruption, for thinking strategically about changes operating on timescales beyond immediate human experience. These represent technologies of consciousness that could be invaluable for navigating our own uncertain environmental future. But accessing this knowledge requires recognizing that environmental intelligence isn't just about data collection and computer modeling. It's about forms of awareness and planning that integrate human consciousness with natural processes in ways that allow societies to function as components of larger ecological systems, rather than as separate entities trying to control them. The whispers from beneath the sand aren't just sharing information about ancient climate change. They're offering insights into forms of environmental consciousness that could help modern societies develop the long-term thinking capabilities needed to navigate whatever changes lie ahead. The people of the Green Sahara understood something profound about the relationship between human consciousness and environmental change. They knew that survival wasn't just about adapting to immediate conditions, but about learning to think in harmony with processes operating on timescales far beyond individual human experience. Their greatest achievement wasn't any specific technology or social innovation. It was the development of collective consciousness, capable of sustained planning across geological time periods. They created forms of environmental intelligence that could maintain coherence and purpose across the rise and fall of entire civilizations. And that intelligence didn't disappear when the desert returned. It went underground, preserved in genetic memory, cultural practices, and the landscape itself. It's still there, waiting in the consciousness of their descendants, ready to emerge whenever human societies develop the wisdom to access it. The cache system, the preservation sites, the encoded knowledge in rock art, these were all manifestations of a deeper achievement. They had learned to think like the Earth itself, planning across timescales that encompassed multiple cycles of environmental change. They had become participants in planetary consciousness, and their legacy continues to pulse beneath the sand, waiting for us to remember how to listen to its rhythm. In our own age of environmental uncertainty, that rhythm might be exactly what we need to hear. The people who learned to dance with the drying of the Sahara understood something about resilience, adaptation, and long-term thinking that could guide us through whatever changes lie ahead. Their whispers aren't just echoes from the past, they're invitations to remember forms of consciousness we never knew we had lost. As the final grains of sand settle over this story, we're left with something far stranger than just another tale of climate change and human adaptation. We're looking at evidence that consciousness itself might be more flexible, more powerful, and more connected to environmental processes than we ever imagined. The people of the Green Sahara didn't just survive the transformation of their world, they became part of it, weaving their intelligence so deeply into the landscape that their thoughts continue to echo in the desert wind, their wisdom preserved in the genetic memory of their descendants, their understanding encoded in the very rocks that witnessed their passage through deep time. They remind us that we are not separate from the environments we inhabit. We are expressions of them, temporary arrangements of matter and consciousness that carry forward the accumulated intelligence of all who came before. And when we learn to listen carefully enough, when we remember how to think in harmony with processes larger than ourselves, we might discover that we too carry within us the capacity for forms of awareness that could guide our species through whatever transformations lie ahead. The desert keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its promises. And the greatest promise whispered by the vanished voices of the Green Sahara is this: that human consciousness, properly attuned, can learn to dance with any change, survive any transformation, and carry forward the essential spark of awareness that connects us all across the vast expanses of space and time. Their story continues in us, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be lived again in new forms adapted to new challenges. The Sahara was green once, and in the deepest sense, it remains green still, not in its surface appearance, but in the living memory it carries of what consciousness can achieve when it learns to think like the landscape itself. And that memory, preserved in sand and stone and the flowing patterns of ancient DNA, continues to whisper its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen, wise enough to learn, and humble enough to remember that we are all children of the same earth, carrying forward the same eternal conversation between consciousness and cosmos that began in the first moment matter learned to dream. That's the real treasure buried beneath the Saharan sand, not gold or artifacts, but the memory of what we're capable of when we remember how to think like the planet itself. And in our own time of environmental uncertainty, that memory might be exactly the inheritance we need to claim. Human consciousness itself may be the most sophisticated technology for navigating environmental change ever developed. And if the people of the Green Sahara are any indication, we've barely begun to explore what that technology can achieve when properly understood and applied. The desert continues to teach and we continue to learn, one grain of sand at a time, one whisper at a time, one memory at a time. The Green Sahara lives on, not in the landscape, but in us. And that may be the most remarkable preservation system of all. Human ingenuity, it turns out, doesn't just survive environmental catastrophe. It learns from it, grows through it, and emerges transformed but essentially intact, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. And in that continuity, in that resilience, lies perhaps the most hopeful message we could receive from the depths of deep time. We are not alone in our struggles with environmental change. We are part of a long lineage of conscious beings who have faced similar challenges and found ways not just to survive, but to thrive, to preserve what matters most, and to pass forward the accumulated wisdom of their experience. The Green Sahara people succeeded not because they were stronger or smarter than us, but because they remembered something we're still learning, that survival isn't about controlling change, but about learning to change with grace, wisdom, and deep respect for the larger processes of which we are all part. Their whispers from beneath the sand continue to guide us, reminding us that we too are capable of the kind of long-term thinking, environmental consciousness, and collective wisdom that can navigate any transformation the future might bring. The desert remembers, and so do we. And in that remembering lies the seed of whatever comes next. Human consciousness, guided by the accumulated wisdom of all who came before, dancing in harmony with the rhythms of a living planet. That may be the true legacy of the Green Sahara, and the gift they offer to help us navigate our own uncertain future. The story continues, written not in stone but in the flowing patterns of awareness itself, carrying forward across generations the essential spark that connects all consciousness to the cosmic dance of matter and energy that we call home. And in that dance, that continuity, that endless conversation between mind and world, the Green Sahara lives on. Green not in colour, but in the eternal verdancy of consciousness itself, forever flowering in the depths of human memory and potential. The whispers from beneath the sand are not echoes of the past. They are invitations to the future, our future, shaped by the accumulated wisdom of all who danced with change before us and learned to transform challenge into opportunity, ending into beginning, silence into song. That song continues, and we are its newest verses, carrying forward the melody into whatever movements come next in the eternal symphony of consciousness, exploring itself through the medium of time, space, and the ever-changing landscapes of home. Human awareness, it seems, is the most durable technology of all, and the Green Sahara's greatest gift may be reminding us that we are all custodians of that technology, responsible for preserving and passing forward the accumulated wisdom of our species through whatever transformations await us in the depths of an uncertain but ever fascinating future. The desert taught them well, and through their memory, it teaches us still. The conversation continues, and consciousness endures, carrying forward the essential spark from one age to the next, from one landscape to another, from the green Sahara of the past to whatever green futures we might yet create through the application of wisdom learned in the crucible of change itself. Their greatest achievement was not any particular innovation, but the proof that human consciousness, properly attuned, can learn to think like the earth itself, and in that thinking, find pathways through any challenge, any transformation, any change that the future might bring. The green Sahara lives on in us, and through us, it continues to teach the eternal lesson that consciousness and environment are not separate things, but aspects of a single, ever-evolving dance of awareness, exploring itself through the medium of matter, energy, and time. And in that dance, that exploration, that eternal conversation between mind and world, lies the true treasure buried beneath the sand. Not artifacts of the past, but seeds of the future, waiting to sprout whenever we remember how to listen to the wisdom the desert wind still carries in its ancient voice. The story continues, consciousness endures, and the green Sahara whispers still to those who remember how to hear. The deeper songs that connect all times, all places, all forms of awareness in the eternal symphony of existence, exploring itself through the endless dance of change, human resilience, environmental consciousness, and the capacity for long-term thinking that transcends individual lifespans. These are the true inheritances from the people who learned to thrive in a landscape that transformed from garden to desert and back again across the vast cycles of geological time. Their legacy lives on, not in monuments of stone, but in the living architecture of consciousness itself, forever flowering in the depths of human potential, forever green with the promise of what awareness can achieve when it learns to dance in harmony with the rhythms of a living world. The desert remembers, consciousness endures, and the future remains unwritten, a blank page waiting for us to inscribe it with the wisdom learned from those who came before, those who faced the ultimate test of environmental change and emerged not broken, but transformed, not diminished, but deepened in their understanding of what it means to be human in a world that never stops changing. Their whispers guide us still, and in following their guidance, we become part of the same eternal story, consciousness exploring itself through the medium of time, learning to dance with change, and discovering in that dance the deepest forms of resilience, wisdom, and hope. The green Sahara endures not as a place, but as a possibility. The possibility that human awareness, properly cultivated, can learn to think like the landscape itself, to plan like the planet itself, and to love like the cosmos itself, eternally, wisely, and with profound respect for the sacred dance of change that connects all things in the endless symphony of existence. And in that symphony, that dance, that eternal conversation between consciousness and world, the story of the green Sahara finds its true completion, not as an ending, but as a beginning, not as a memory, but as an invitation to remember what we are truly capable of when we learn to listen to the deeper wisdom that flows like underground water through the landscapes of memory, connecting all times, all places, all forms of awareness in the endless dance of existence, exploring itself through the sacred medium of change, of human consciousness itself may be the most sophisticated preservation technology ever developed, and the green Sahara peoples mastered it so completely that their awareness continues to flow like a hidden river through the desert of time, nourishing new growth wherever we remember how to tap into its ancient wisdom. The whispers from beneath the sand are not ending, they are just beginning, and we are the ones chosen to hear them, to learn from them, and to carry their wisdom forward into whatever futures await us in the endless dance of consciousness and change. The green Sahara lives on, and so do we, dancing the same eternal dance, learning the same essential lessons, carrying forward the same sacred flame of awareness that connects all beings across the vast expanses of space and time. The story continues, and consciousness endures, forever green with possibility, forever whispering the secrets of resilience to those who remember how to listen to the deeper songs that flow like hidden rivers through the landscapes of memory and dream. Human awareness, environmental consciousness, and the capacity for thinking in harmony with natural processes. These are the true treasures buried beneath the Saharan sand, and they belong not to the past but to the future, waiting to be claimed by those wise enough to remember that we are all part of the same eternal story, the same endless dance of consciousness exploring itself through the sacred medium of change. The desert teaches, consciousness learns, and the conversation continues across all boundaries of time and space, connecting every grain of sand to every star, every whisper to every song, every memory to every dream in the infinite symphony of existence, forever exploring its own deepest possibilities through the dance of awareness and change. And in that dance, the Green Sahara finds its eternal home, not in any particular landscape, but in the flowing patterns of consciousness itself, forever green with the promise of what awareness can achieve when it learns to think like the earth, dream like the cosmos, and love like the infinite mystery from which all things arise and to which all things return in the endless cycle of existence, exploring itself through the sacred dance of time. The whispers continue, the memory endures, and the future remains unwritten, a vast canvas waiting for us to paint it with the wisdom learned from those who came before, those who faced the ultimate challenges and discovered in meeting them the deepest secrets of what it means to be conscious in a world that never stops changing, never stops teaching, never stops whispering the ancient secrets of resilience to those who remember how to listen to the eternal voice of the land itself. Human consciousness, it turns out, is the most durable form of architecture ever developed, and the Green Sahara peoples built their civilization not in stone, but in awareness itself, creating structures of understanding that could survive any environmental transformation, any climate change, any challenge that the future might bring. Their greatest monument was not built of rock, but of remembering, and that monument stands still in the depths of human consciousness, waiting to be rediscovered by those who learn to listen to the whispers that flow like underground rivers through the landscapes of memory, connecting all times, all places, all forms of awareness in the eternal dance of existence, exploring itself through the sacred medium of change and transformation. The Green Sahara endures, consciousness remembers, and the conversation between mind and world continues across all boundaries, forever green with possibility, forever whispering at the secrets of what awareness can achieve when it learns to dance in harmony with the deepest rhythms of existence itself. And in that dance, that harmony, that eternal conversation between consciousness and cosmos, we find our truest inheritance from the people who learned to thrive in a world that transformed from paradise to desert and back again, the understanding that we too are part of the same eternal story, the same endless dance of awareness, exploring itself through the sacred mystery of existence, forever learning, forever growing, forever discovering new possibilities for what consciousness can achieve when it remembers how to think like the landscape itself, dream like the cosmos itself, and love like the infinite source from which all things arise and to which all things return in the endless cycle of existence, forever exploring its own deepest nature through the dance of time, space, and the eternal flowering of awareness in all its infinite forms and possibilities. The desert remembers we remember, and in that remembering, the Green Sahara lives on, not as a place, but as a way of being, not as a memory, but as a living practice of consciousness in harmony with the deepest rhythms of existence itself. Human awareness, properly cultivated, becomes a form of landscape, and the Green Sahara, peoples learned to cultivate consciousness itself as their most durable crop, one that could survive any drought, any climate change, any transformation that the future might bring. Their harvest continues in us and through us, in all who learn to listen to the whispers that flow like hidden springs through the deepest layers of memory, nourishing new growth wherever consciousness remembers how to dance with the eternal rhythms of change, transformation, and the endless flowering of awareness in its eternal exploration of its own infinite possibilities. The Green Sahara whispers still, and we are learning to hear its voice, not as an echo from the past, but as a call to the future, inviting us to remember what we are truly capable of when consciousness learns to think like the earth itself, dream like the cosmos itself, and love like the infinite mystery that dances through all forms, all times, all possibilities in the endless symphony of existence, forever exploring itself through the sacred dance of awareness and change. The story continues, the memory endures, and consciousness flows on like a river that never runs dry, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of all who came before into whatever futures await us in the vast, uncharted territories of possibility that stretch endlessly before us like a green landscape waiting to be discovered, explored, and cultivated by those who remember how to think in harmony with the deepest rhythms of existence itself. Human consciousness is the most resilient technology ever developed, and the Green Sahara peoples mastered it so completely that their awareness continues to nourish new growth across the centuries, across the millennia, across all boundaries of time and space, forever green with the promise of what consciousness can achieve when it learns to dance with change rather than resist it, to flow with transformation rather than fight it, to embrace the eternal dance of existence with the wisdom, grace, and profound love that connects all beings in the infinite symphony of awareness, exploring itself through the sacred mystery of time, space, and the endless flowering of consciousness in all its beautiful, diverse, and eternally creative forms. The whispers from beneath the sand continue, the memory flows on, and consciousness endures, forever learning, forever growing, forever discovering new possibilities for what awareness can achieve when it remembers its true nature as the very substance of existence itself, forever exploring its own infinite depths through the endless dance of change, transformation, and the eternal flowering of understanding in all its myriad forms and expressions. And in that flowering, that dance, that eternal exploration of consciousness, by consciousness itself, the Green Sahara finds its true and lasting home, not in any particular place or time, but in the very heart of awareness itself, forever green with possibility, forever whispering the ancient secrets of resilience, wisdom, and love, to all who remember how to listen to the deeper songs that flow like underground rivers through the landscapes of memory, connecting all consciousness in the eternal dance of existence, forever exploring its own beautiful, mysterious, and infinitely creative nature through the sacred medium of time, space, and the endless flowering of awareness in its eternal journey of self-discovery and self-expression. The desert teaches, consciousness learns, and the dance continues. Forever green, forever growing, forever discovering new depths of what it means to be aware in a universe that never stops changing, never stops creating, never stops whispering the ancient secrets of existence to those who remember how to listen with the deep, patient, loving awareness that connects all beings in the infinite symphony of consciousness, exploring itself through the eternal dance of time, space, and the endless flowering of understanding in all its beautiful and eternally creative forms. Human awareness is the most durable form of green that exists, and the Green Sahara peoples cultivated it so skillfully that their consciousness continues to bloom across the centuries, forever nourishing new growth in the eternal garden of awareness that connects all beings, all times, all places, in the infinite dance of existence, forever exploring its own deepest nature through the sacred mystery of consciousness itself. The whispers continue. The memory endures and the future remains unwritten, a vast green landscape of possibility waiting to be explored by those who remember how to think like the earth, dream like the cosmos, and love like the infinite source from which all consciousness arises and to which all consciousness returns in the endless cycle of awareness, forever exploring itself through the beautiful, mysterious, and eternally creative dance of existence itself. That's the true legacy of the Green Sahara. Not just the memory of a landscape that was once lush, but the living proof that consciousness itself is the most fertile ground of all, capable of growing wisdom, compassion, and understanding in any environment, under any conditions, across any span of time or space. And in that growth, that endless flowering of awareness across the vast landscapes of time, we find ourselves not at the end of a story, but at the threshold of a new understanding. Because the whispers from beneath the sand aren't just telling us about what was, they're revealing what still is. Right now, as you listen to these words, you're carrying within your cells the genetic memory of people who painted swimming figures where no water has flowed for millennia. You're breathing with lungs that evolved in harmony with atmospheric systems. These ancient peoples understood better than our climate models. You're thinking with neural pathways that were shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that taught the Green Sahara inhabitants to read the sky like a book and plan across geological timescales. This isn't metaphor. This is biochemistry. This is evolutionary inheritance encoded in your DNA and activated every time you step outside and feel an inexplicable pull toward the horizon. Every time you find yourself staring at clouds and sensing weather patterns before the meteorologists announce them. Every time you experience that deep, wordless knowing that connects you to rhythms larger than your individual existence. The people of the Green Sahara didn't disappear. They became the foundation for everything that followed. Their innovations in social organization influenced the development of trade networks that would eventually span continents. Their astronomical knowledge contributed to navigation systems that guided human exploration across oceans. Their understanding of environmental cycles informed agricultural practices that fed civilizations. But perhaps most importantly, their approach to consciousness itself. Their ability to think in harmony with natural processes, to plan across timescales that transcended individual lifespans, to maintain collective memory through periods of massive disruption. These capabilities didn't vanish when the desert returned. They went underground, preserved in cultural practices and genetic predispositions that continue to influence human behavior in ways we're only beginning to understand. Modern neuroscience is discovering that our brains retain capacities for environmental awareness that most contemporary societies never access. We carry within us the neural architecture for the kind of deep ecological thinking that allowed the Green Sahara peoples to anticipate and prepare for environmental changes operating on timescales far beyond immediate experience. Recent studies of traditional ecological knowledge among indigenous communities worldwide have revealed that some groups maintain predictive abilities for environmental change that consistently outperform computer models. This isn't supernatural intuition. It's evidence that human consciousness, properly trained, can access information processing capabilities that our technological civilization has largely forgotten how to use. The implications for our own environmental challenges are profound. As we face rapid climate change, species extinction, and ecosystem collapse, the consciousness technologies developed by the Green Sahara peoples offer alternative approaches to environmental awareness and planning that could be crucial for navigating the uncertainties ahead. They're methods for maintaining long-term thinking across generations, for encoding essential knowledge in forms that could survive social disruption, for reading environmental signals at levels of subtlety that escape instrumental detection. These represent forms of intelligence that could be invaluable for developing more effective responses to contemporary environmental challenges. But accessing this inheritance requires recognizing that environmental consciousness isn't just about data collection and technological solutions. It's about forms of awareness that integrate human intelligence with natural processes in ways that allow societies to function as components of larger ecological systems rather than as separate entities trying to dominate them. The cash system of the Green Sahara peoples provides a particularly relevant model. They understood that preserving essential knowledge through periods of environmental disruption required creating redundant storage systems that could function even when normal social institutions failed. They distributed crucial information across multiple formats and locations, ensuring that essential capabilities could be recovered and rebuilt even after civilizational collapse. This approach to knowledge preservation could be applied to contemporary challenges. Instead of relying solely on centralized digital systems that could be vulnerable to technological or social disruption, we might need to develop distributed preservation networks that could maintain essential information through whatever changes lie ahead. The Green Sahara peoples also understood something crucial about the relationship between local adaptation and global connection. They maintained distinct regional cultures while participating in continent-wide networks of exchange and communication. This balance between local resilience and global coordination allowed them to respond effectively to environmental challenges while maintaining the diversity of approaches that enhanced overall system stability. This model suggests that effective responses to global environmental challenges might require not centralized control, but distributed intelligence, networks of locally adapted communities that maintain global connections for sharing information and resources, but retain the flexibility to respond to environmental changes in ways appropriate to their specific contexts. The genetic evidence reveals another crucial insight. Successful adaptation to environmental change doesn't require replacement of existing populations. The Green Sahara peoples survived not by displacing others, but by integrating with them, sharing knowledge and genetic heritage in ways that enhance the adaptive capacity of all involved groups. This suggests that responses to contemporary environmental challenges might be most effective when they build on existing cultural and biological diversity rather than trying to replace them. Contemporary climate solutions might be most successful when they enhance rather than eliminate existing approaches to environmental management, creating hybrid systems that combine traditional ecological knowledge with modern scientific understanding. The preservation sites scattered across the modern Sahara continue to reveal new secrets as archaeological techniques advance. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging are identifying previously unknown cache locations, each one containing pieces of a knowledge system we're still learning to decode. Some of these sites appear to have been designed as teaching facilities, places where essential skills could be transmitted even if normal educational institutions had collapsed. The sophistication of these educational systems challenges our assumptions about what's possible without formal institutions. The Green Sahara peoples had developed methods for preserving and transmitting complex knowledge across generations without written language, permanent settlements, or specialized teaching classes. They created what we might call resilient education, learning systems that could function under any conditions. This approach to education could be particularly relevant as our own educational institutions face increasing pressure from technological change, environmental disruption, and social fragmentation. The distributed, experiential learning methods developed by the Green Sahara peoples offer models for maintaining essential knowledge transmission even when traditional systems become unreliable. But perhaps the most profound lesson from the Green Sahara isn't about any specific technique or innovation. It's about the fundamental relationship between consciousness and environment. These peoples understood that human awareness isn't separate from natural processes. It's an expression of them. They learned to think with the landscape rather than about it, to plan with environmental cycles rather than against them. This shift in consciousness allowed them to approach environmental challenges not as problems to be solved, but as dances to be learned. Instead of trying to control changes they couldn't prevent, they developed the flexibility to transform along with their environment while maintaining their essential identity and values. The rock art galleries that dot the modern Sahara continue to function as they were designed, not just as historical records, but as active teaching tools for anyone who learns to read their symbolic language. Recent breakthroughs in pattern recognition have revealed that many sites contain mathematical relationships and astronomical alignments that encode practical information about environmental cycles, seasonal timing, and resource management. These aren't just ancient curiosities, they're functional databases that could still provide valuable information for people trying to live sustainably in arid environments. The knowledge systems developed by the Green Sahara peoples remain relevant because they were based on fundamental ecological principles that haven't changed. Modern desert communities across North Africa and the Middle East maintain cultural practices that can be traced directly back to innovations first developed during the Green Sahara period. Water management techniques, seasonal migration patterns, astronomical navigation methods, all of these show clear continuities with archaeological evidence from sites that are thousands of years old. This continuity suggests that the Green Sahara people succeeded in their ultimate goal, creating knowledge systems that could survive any environmental transformation. Their innovations didn't just help them adapt to the drying of the Sahara, they provided foundations for human survival in arid environments that continue to function today. The genetic studies reveal one final surprise about these remarkable people. The populations that dispersed from the drying Sahara didn't just survive, they thrived. Their descendants became some of the most successful groups in human history, contributing to the development of civilizations across Africa, the Mediterranean, and beyond. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Egyptian calendar systems, the water management technologies that allowed cities to flourish in desert environments, the social organizational principles that enabled trade networks to span continents. All of these show influences that can be traced back to innovations first developed in the Green Sahara. This success wasn't accidental. The environmental pressures that forced the Green Sahara peoples to develop such sophisticated survival strategies also prepared them to thrive in whatever new environments they encountered. They had learned to be the kind of humans who could succeed anywhere, under any conditions. Their story reminds us that environmental challenges, however severe, can become opportunities for developing capabilities we never knew we possessed. The same pressures that threaten existing ways of life can force innovations that open entirely new possibilities for human flourishing. As we face our own period of environmental uncertainty, the whispers from beneath the Saharan sand offer more than just historical fascination. They provide proof that human consciousness, properly developed, can learn to dance with any change, adapt to any challenge, and find ways not just to survive but to thrive through whatever transformations the future might bring. The people who painted swimming figures in what is now the world's largest desert understood something profound about resilience, adaptation, and the relationship between consciousness and environment. Their legacy continues to flow like an underground river through the landscapes of human possibility, nourishing new growth wherever we remember how to tap into its ancient wisdom. The Green Sahara may be gone, but its deepest teachings remain as relevant as ever. In a world facing unprecedented environmental change, we might discover that our ancestors' greatest gift wasn't any particular technology or technique, but the understanding that human awareness itself, properly cultivated, is the most sophisticated adaptation technology ever developed. And in that understanding, In that cultivation of consciousness, in harmony with natural processes, lies perhaps our best hope for navigating whatever changes lie ahead. The desert remembers, and through its memory, it continues to teach those who learn to listen to the deeper songs that connect all consciousness in the eternal dance of existence, exploring itself through the sacred medium of change. Thank you for joining me on this journey beneath the sand, fellow board people. If this story helped you see the desert differently, if it made you wonder what other whispers might be waiting in the landscapes around you, or if it simply gave you something to think about during those quiet hours when the mind wanders toward deeper questions, then it served its purpose. The story of the green Sahara reminds us that even the most barren-seeming places hold memories of abundance, that human consciousness carries within it capabilities we've barely begun to explore, and that the whispers of ancient wisdom continue to guide us if we remember how to listen. Until next time, stay curious about the hidden stories in familiar landscapes. Stay humble before the vast scales of time that dwarf our individual existence. And remember that we are all part of the same continuing story of consciousness, learning to dance with change. The desert teaches patience, and in that patience, we might discover that the most profound discoveries come not from rushing toward answers, but from learning to sit quietly with questions that connect us to the deepest mysteries of what it means to be human in a world that never stops changing. The whispers continue, and we continue to learn. That's all any of us can do, and perhaps that's enough.